Hi, welcome to Downtown Rotary. I'm Mark DeGraff, your president, and we are glad you're here. Alternately, this is not National Hug a Tornado Day, so listen for sirens. Let's start off with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. You may be seated. Now on guest introductions, we have Joan Wagnon, and also with the Rotary Minute. How about in just a minute, I'll do guest introductions if somebody brings me up the slips. And today our Rotary Minute comes to you spontaneously. I want to give you a quick update. The foundation is working really hard, and they got 13 proposals for the $20,000 grant that your Rotary Foundation gives out on your behalf. And they're working really hard to pare those down, and then talking with several of those committee members, it's a challenge because nobody wants to say no to any of the great organizations who applied, and we're fortunate to be in the position that we are to support them. So if anybody who's on the foundation board, and especially on those grant committees that's evaluating those applications, looks like they could use an extra shot of caffeine with all the reading they've been doing, please bring them a cup of coffee at your leisure. Thank you. And we have 0 guests today, so guest introductions are very brief. Moving right along, our May featured charity is the Topeka Library Foundation for the Dolly Parton Imagination Library Literacy Program for children birth through age 5. This program will allow 14 children to participate and be ready for kindergarten. Each enrolled child gets in the mail a free age-appropriate book every month. Now quickly for announcements, Monique Pittman-Louie, would you please come forward if you would? And I do, while she's coming forward, would love to let you know that David Beck and Yana Ross sent me an email this morning. I want to read a little bit of that to you. Dear Mark, we have a developing crisis with one of the exchange students who will be coming this August, and I would like to ask for help at the meeting today. One of our clubs in our city agreed to host Angel, a 15-year-old girl from Brazil, and had 2 other members willing to be host families. The first host decided that they couldn't host this year and told us just this week. So Angel is actually enrolled to be a student at Washburn Rural in the fall. She's 15 from Brazil. She loves animals and has a dog. She works 4 hours a day. She and her mom live there in Brazil together, and she works 4 hours a day to help support her family. She also is very active in her church. Loves reading, listening to music, and cooking, especially desserts with her mother. So if that's on your heart to be a host family, or if you know of anybody who might be open to being a host family, please help spread the word and help us find Angel a place to go. Monique, thank you for coming up. It is my pleasure to present you with your blue badge. In order to do that, I'm not going to finish. What you do, because Fargo Rotary, we recycle. We're very into clean water and good environmental work.
Thank you so much.
Welcome to the club. Thank you for the good work you're doing already.
I am truly honored to have a blue badge.
Oh, a photo.
Photo op.
Oh, sorry.
Oh. All this security when you're a business owner.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Any Friend X announcements today? Anybody want to share a Friend X announcements?
I got a friend.
Hey, awesome.
I got in the mail a Barnes & Noble gift card to start my summer reading, so that was so cool.
Nice.
Awesome. Thank you to her Friend X. If you have ties that you no longer wear, bring them to meetings and we will donate those to Interact clubs. If you are open to helping with district interviews for the 3 Rotary International Peace Fellowships, they're the first week of June. Contact Patty Millard from the Topeka South Club if you'd like to be a part of those interviews. Jacob Wamigo and Tony Weingartner, please come forward if you would. And while they're coming forward, I'd like to announce that We have an upcoming fun event. June 6th will be a dedication of a new facade for Constitution Hall and some updates coming up at the Rotary Pocket Park. So please put June 6th on your calendar. That will be a fun evening. It's a happy hour event, I believe. And Grant will be here next week to tell us a little bit more about that. And I'm not sure of this, but there may be a Jim Ogle sighting there that day. I'm just not sure. But please put that on your calendar. Gentlemen.
Red badge. Sir. Welcome. Thank you. Jacob, welcome. Thank you. Thank you for transferring.
Children and Jacob are two of our newest members.
Nobody wants to take photos of me.
I can't wait on the bed. I wouldn't either.
One last thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Our two of our newest members, Tony works for the KBI, and Jacob is a transfer from Topeka South Rotary, so their loss and our gain. Thank you both, and welcome. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce Robert Gould, who will introduce our speaker today. Robert.
Thank you, President Mark. I have the good fortune to introduce today's speaker, one of our own in downtown Rotary. Roger Aeschliman is a Senior Vice President and Trust Officer at Core First Bank and Trust. He's a certified trust and financial advisor. Prior to banking, Roger was the Deputy Secretary of the Kansas Department of Human Resources under Bill Graves, and before that served as Chief of Staff to the Speaker of the Kansas House of Representatives. His early career was as an award-winning newspaper reporter for the Topeka Capital Journal. Roger is a retired colonel with 32 years service in the Kansas Army National Guard and U.S. Army Reserves. He served 3 command tours at the senior staff level as the operations planner for the 35th Division. Roger volunteered for 2 combat deployments and was decorated with the Bronze Star for his tour of duty in Iraq and the Defense Meritorious Service Medal for his tour in Kosovo. He is a graduate of Kansas State and received his master's from KU. He and his wife Robin are both community leaders in many civic, education, and military organizations. Roger is a published author. His Iraq memoir is titled Victory Denied. Everything you know about Iraq is wrong. His presentation today is America Won in Korea and Vietnam. I'm looking forward to this. This is the first time I've ever heard Vietnam described as a win. So we'll see how this goes. I served there. On a lighter note, Roger enjoys hard labor, especially cutting firewood, and loves Oreos and beer, but not generally at the same time. Roger and Robin are proud parents of 2 children. I think we should all be proud of and grateful for Roger's service to his club, to the greater Topeka community, to the state of Kansas, to these United States, and when we reflect on Iraq and Kosovo, the world. Welcome, Roger.
Very, very much. Thank you for the very nice introduction, Robert. I appreciate it. Some of you may not know that Robert is a combat veteran of Vietnam himself. Like me, a dumbass tanker. This can be a hard conversation to even begin, so I'll just blurt it out. The United States of America won the wars in Korea and Vietnam. This is contrary to what everyone knows. Our national folkway has come to define Korea as a draw. That war ended in an armistice rather than a surrender. It was an agreement to stop fighting rather than capitulation by the loser. And this is true, but it's also meaningless in terms of victory or defeat. World War I ended in an armistice, yet it was a decisive win for the Allied powers. And it's hard to even start talking about Vietnam when most Americans know the USA was driven out of the jungles and the rice paddies, as documented by that last iconic helicopter abandoning the desperate hordes on the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Nationally and worldwide, the feeling is that Korea was a tie because things ended up pretty much where they began, and that Vietnam was a loss because the USA is gone and the Vietnamese are still there. These are feelings, they're not evidence. If a disinterested observer were to look at both wars without any preconceptions and to use a measurable standard for victory or defeat rather than feelings, the answer would be the United States won in Korea and Vietnam. So to understand this conclusion, we got to clarify the notion of winning. There are three levels of war: tactical, operational, and strategic, and these are the military's measuring sticks. Success can occur at any of these levels, and generally for the U.S. military, continued success tactically, operationally, and strategically means winning. But that's not enough for a nation to determine winning or losing in a war. Why do nations war at all? Karl von Clausewitz said, "War is an act of violence intended to compel our opponent to fulfill our will. War is a continuation of policy by other means. So a nation goes to war in order to force a desired behavior or to inflict its national will upon another nation." If war is chosen by a nation state, how is winning determined? Tactics, operations, and strategies do not mean national victory. They are only processes and tools to reach victory, but they are not victory. For a nation state to chalk up a win, it comes down to this: the political goals of the national leadership have to be achieved. If we audit Korea and Vietnam through this objective lens, that the outcomes sought by our elected leaders of the United States of America were achieved, an impartial observer would agree America won. The second key to understanding these two victories is to understand why our soldiers fought there at all. And the key is that neither the nations nor the peoples of Korea or Vietnam mattered. The lands, the resources, the locations, the populations, none of these things were important. The countries were isolated, underdeveloped, under-resourced backwaters. The populations were insignificant. Korea and Vietnam were only battlegrounds because other battles in more important places with more important populations and more important resources had to be prevented. This sounds harsh, but it's absolutely true. The enemy was not small-scale communism in Korea or Vietnam. The enemy was the USSR, and to a lesser degree, China. By fighting in Korea and Vietnam, World War III was prevented. Half the world's population was saved from the aggressive expansion of totalitarianism. Understanding National Security Council Report 68, dated April 14, 1950, explains that. NSC 68 identified the Soviet Union as the main threat to the USA and to world peace. NSC 68 created the policy of containment of communist expansion. The central theme was how to contain Soviet and Sino-adventurism while at the same time avoiding nuclear war in Europe. A quote from the report: "For several centuries it had proved impossible for any one nation to gain such preponderant strength that a coalition of other nations could not in time face it with greater strength. The international scene was marked by recurring periods of violence and war, but a system of sovereign and independent states was maintained over which no one state was able to achieve hegemony. Now, the Soviet Union, unlike previous aspirants to hegemony, is animated by a new fanatic faith antithetical to our own, and it seeks to impose its absolute authority over the rest of the world. Any substantial further extension of the area under the control and domination of the Kremlin would raise the possibility that no coalition adequate to confront the Kremlin with greater strength could be assembled." So, Korea was about preventing World War III in Eastern Europe. Vietnam was about keeping aggressive communism out of India, the Middle East, Indonesia, Southwest and Western Pacific, and Japan. Those places mattered, those populations were significant, those resources were vital. Lines had to be drawn in the sand, and the lines were drawn in Korea and Vietnam. The war in Korea was won because all the national goals of the USA were met. Europe was secured against the USSR threat, and World War III never happened. The war in Vietnam was won because ever-changing goals of each successive U.S. president were met, threats against India, the Middle East, and Indonesia were turned back, and World War III was deterred again. The United States terminated both Korea and Vietnam wars and left both countries under terms set by our own presidents. Because battlegrounds were chosen in Korea and Vietnam, the real enemy, Russia, and to a lesser degree China, changed their behaviors and the U.S. goals were accomplished. So the United States won in Korea and Vietnam. Let's start with Korea. The youngest veterans of Korean War are at least 80 years old now. Since 1953, they've listened to the lie that they fought to a draw. 60 years later, since the end of the Korean War, the truth is told that all the expressed goals of the United States and the United Nations were met. Based on achieving national outcomes sought by our elected leaders, America won. Again, Korea was just not important. It was not worth fighting over. Preventing European nuclear World War III and stopping the spread of Russian and Chinese communist expansion was important. Harry Truman, under his time in office, NSC 68 was created. He adopted the conclusions and he drew his line at the 38th parallel in Korea. Communist North Korea invaded the South on June 24th, 1950. In response to the onslaught, Truman's national policy was immediate and clear. On June 25th, 1950, the next day he said, quote, "If we are tough now, if we stand up to them like we did in Greece 3 years ago, they won't take any next steps. But if we just stand by, they'll move into Iran, they'll take over the whole Middle East. There's no telling what they'll do if we don't put up a fight now," end quote. The United Nations Security Council approved Resolution 82, calling the attack a breach of the peace and for the immediate cessation of hostilities, for North Korea to withdraw back to the 38th parallel. Resolution 83 followed the next day, recommending that members of the UN furnish such assistance to the Republic of Korea, South Korea, as may be necessary to repel the armed attack and to restore international peace and security in the area. The entire Korean War was fought under the aegis of the UN with significant support from over 50 other combat nations, but it was under overall US command with a preponderance of US soldiery and equipment. The early phases of the war, North Korea had significant initial success. They ran over the outgunned Task Force Smith. They pinned the Americans up into the Pusan perimeter at the far south of Korea. Then there was a massive U.S. buildup, a breakout of the perimeter, the brilliant end-run landing by MacArthur at Incheon, and a routed North Korean army chased all the way back to the China border. The U.S. advance north to the Yalu River was followed by the insubordination and crack-up of General Douglas MacArthur and the sudden but not unexpected counterattack of the Chinese. UN forces retreated, taking heavy casualties. At this point, that was all in 8 months of the war, the first 8 months of a 3-year war. This led to discussion about expanding from a limited war with limited objectives into a general war against China. Nuclear usage was on the table, and it's at this time the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Omar Bradley, made his famous comments that expanding into a full general war against China was terribly wrong. Bradley said, quote, "Red China is not the powerful nation that's seeking to dominate the world. Frankly, in the opinion of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this strategy, total war against China, would involve us in the wrong war at the wrong place at the wrong time against the wrong enemy." But the 8th Army firmed up, held, and then regained ground and established the 38th parallel as a front line for the remainder of the war. The U.S. and UN both overreached in going all the way to the Yalu River in hope of winning a unified democracy, and the Chinese overreached in the hope of gaining a unified single communist nation. Peace was inevitable and only a matter of time of saving face. All Truman needed to do was hang on to enough territory and kill enough communists to bring North Korea and China to the table with as few American casualties as possible. Throughout the Truman administration, the official policy was to uphold the United Nations mandate to restore the 38th parallel and maintain a freely elected independent government in Korea. UN forces, overwhelmingly US troops and US generals, achieved this goal throughout Truman's term of office. The 1952 election of General Dwight D. Eisenhower as president was assured when he promised to go to Korea to seek an end to the fighting. It was clear to all observers that Eisenhower was going to get peace. The heavy lifting had already been done by Truman and the American soldiers. Ike's choice was either a total war with the Chinese, including nuclear weapons, or a continued stalemate with 1,000 US casualties every week. Ike decided that neither type of slaughter was acceptable to him, and he rightly judged that China was just as eager to get out. So Ike chose peace. An armistice was signed on July 27, 1953. South Korea existed as a representative democracy, its border restored at the 38th parallel. The UN was satisfied with the result of the Korean War and perceived it as a victory. It passed 2 resolutions approving the armistice and congratulating the UN forces. Truman believed he had won in Korea and kept dominoes from falling around the world. In his later years, he, quote, said, "We prevented Tito from taking Trieste right after the German fold-up. We forced Stalin out of Iran. We saved Greece and Turkey. We stayed in Berlin, and we knocked the socks off the communists in Korea. We gave the Philippines a free government," end quote. North Korea, China, and Russia suffered 1.5 million casualties and another 1.5 million civilian deaths. US combat deaths in Korea were 34,000. Total Allied casualties were half of the North's total and were overwhelmingly South Korean civilians butchered by North Koreans and Chinese. Excuse me. China and North Korea abandoned their attack on South Korea. They ceased their undesirable behavior. They yielded to the will of the United States. There are 2 nations there today, and even a superficial glance shows the fruits of US victory. South Korea is a strong democracy with a thriving capitalist economy, holding a powerful position in the first world. North Korea is the third world, stunted cult of personality, military Maoist state, still haunted by famine, without electricity and running water in most of the country. Militarily, by achieving national policy expressed by civilian authority and considering the long-term success of South Korea and the long-term failure of North Korea, the United States of America won the Korean War. Similarly, the argument for American victory in Vietnam hinges on why Americans were there at all. And the answer is, Vietnam as a nation and the Vietnamese people were just not important. Vietnam was only important as the domino triggering worldwide communist expansion. It was too late to save China or Eastern Europe, but Western Europe, India, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Japan could still be saved. Vietnam became the proxy battleground for the war in Europe and preventing World War III. President Truman adopted policies in the USA to take a stand before the USSR and China dominated so many lands that no coalition could be mustered against them. Truman focused on his hot war in Korea, allowed the French to fight their own war in Vietnam. Truman's goal was to block communist expansion in the region, but not to get involved in further warfare in Vietnam. He succeeded. Under Truman, the United States won in Vietnam. Eisenhower's Vietnam policy was low-cost containment in order to prevent other nations from falling to communism. Robert McNamara explained, and quote, "In exchange for mere money and a few Americans in Saigon to offer advice of various sorts, communism was being contained at the 17th parallel in Vietnam and Indochina." During Eisenhower's 2 terms, he fought a covert war in Laos, established a U.S. political presence and hegemony over South Vietnamese President Diem, and he introduced military advisors into South Vietnam. He prevented dominoes from falling using minimal military effort, meeting his stated policy goals. Under Eisenhower, the United States won in Vietnam. Eisenhower told Kennedy that Laos was the key to the whole area, and it was just a matter of time until South Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, and Burma would all collapse causal from Laos. It was a concern with Laos that it would spill out in all directions that made this Eisenhower's priority to Kennedy rather than the handful of U.S. advisors in Vietnam. Kennedy said, quote, Whatever is going to happen in Laos, an American invasion, a communist victory, or whatever, I wish it would happen before we take over and get blamed for it. As predicted, the Laotian conflict quickly enveloped Vietnam, especially over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, already as early as 1961, funneling soldier supplies and munitions into South Vietnam. Kennedy's initial policy was to support President Diem, but with as little military means as possible, and then to pull out after his re-election. But the Civil War in Vietnam intensified with murder and assassination by both the Viet Cong and Diem's forces. By late '63, it had become clear that Diem had failed and had to go. South Vietnamese generals plotted a coup, and Kennedy gave the nod. Kennedy later said he had hoped Diem would not be killed, but he didn't care enough to stop the coup from occurring. Kennedy never squared his desire to avoid looking like an appeasing weenie versus his natural instinct to disengage, even in his final days. During his presidency, he increased the U.S. presence in Vietnam. He increased funding for the Diem administration. He ordered the coup of Diem and was on the brink of increasing the number of U.S. advisors on the ground. His actions matched his policy. His policies were implemented and sustained by the United States military. No additional dominoes toppled. Under a reluctant Kennedy, the United States won in Vietnam. President Lyndon Johnson found himself thrust into a war he did not want, he could not understand, he was totally unprepared to handle. Johnson wanted the military to tell him what winning the war meant. And then Johnson and company wanted to tell the military how to do that. And that's completely backwards. If there's a single root cause for the difficulty in prosecuting the war in Vietnam from Johnson on, that was it. From '63 until '69, Johnson blundered ahead, increasing troop strength, increasing the scope and reach of the war, and increasing the killing. You could write and talk forever about the escalation of the war, the battles, the bombings, the protests, the politics of it all, but for Johnson, it boiled down to this, quote, "I knew from the start I was bound to be crucified either way I moved. If I left the woman I really loved, the great society, in order to get involved with that bitch of a war on the other side of the world, I would lose everything at home. All my programs, all my hopes to feed the hungry and shelter the homeless, all my plans to provide education and medical care to the browns and the blacks and the lame and the poor. But if I left the war and let the communists take over South Vietnam, then I would be seen as a coward and an appeaser. My nation would be seen as an appeaser. We would both find it impossible to accomplish anything for anybody, anywhere in the entire globe," end quote. In '65, Johnson sent 150,000 American soldiers to Vietnam, and they started dying in noticeable numbers. But '65 was also the year that cut the legs off of the domino theory. India won its border disputes against East and West Pakistan and went in its own independent path. Instantly, 500 million people were off the path to communism, and a solid barrier was in place to the west of China and south of the USSR. In Indonesia, leftist strongman Sukarno was driven from power, and in a violent belch, 300,000 Indonesian communists were killed, most of them Chinese. China did not react, and another 100 million people were removed from the communist path, and a solid barrier was placed south of China. This changed international map was not recognized in Washington, D.C. by the Johnson administration. The domino theory underlying all of Vietnam policy had just slammed into a wall. At this point, had Johnson and his supporters pulled the plug in Vietnam, the dominoes of Laos, Cambodia would surely have fallen, perhaps Burma, but no more. Instead, because Johnson was weak and indecisive, he escalated the war, but not enough for a conclusive combat victory. Johnson wound up seeing all his fears come true. He looked like an unmanly appeaser. He was distracted from pursuing his dreams of domestic welfare statism. He failed to hold the USA united in prosecuting the war, and he failed to hold on to office. It was a total personal failure for LBJ. But in terms of winning or losing in Vietnam, he achieved his stated goals. During his 5 years as president, he repeated the central policy of not seeing South Vietnam erased from the map and not allowing other dominoes to fall. He avoided nuclear war with Russia and China and Third World War in Europe. Perhaps he was just plain dumb lucky, but Johnson's actions matched his policy. His policies were implemented by the United States military. Under Johnson, the United States won in Vietnam. Richard M. Nixon saw the changed political landscape of the domino theory, and he saw that while a few minor dominoes might fall if Vietnam failed, but the world was much safer than it had been in the 50s and early 60s, Nixon ran on the platform of peace with honor and immediately began to disengage. By the end of 1969, Nixon had pulled 60,000 soldiers out of Vietnam and had drawn North Vietnam into secret negotiations with Ambassador Henry Kissinger. Nixon said, "I'm going to do my damnedest to end the war. I'm approaching the whole question with only two operating principles. I won't make it hard for the North Vietnamese if they genuinely want a settlement, but I will not be the first president of the United States to lose a war," end quote. Newly elected President Nixon was proud of his 1973 peace agreement. He had achieved peace where 3 previous U.S. presidents had failed. Nixon won peace for the United States and left South America as a self-reliant, independent nation in charge of its own affairs with the 3rd largest military in the world. From 69 through Nixon's leaving office in 74, South Vietnam was an independent state. No other states fell to communism. Nixon's actions matched his policy, and his policies were implemented and sustained by the United States military. Under Nixon, the United States won in Vietnam. Gerald Ford was president when the helicopters evacuated the Saigon embassy in 1975. America had been out of Vietnam for 2 years by then. Under Ford, the United States neither won nor lost anything in Vietnam. There simply is no loss there. When you achieve all your national policy goals and the military achieves all the required engagements, you have won. So America won in Vietnam. Going forward as a nation, I think we can only pray that our senior elected officials, our senior appointed government leaders, and our military leaders will have learned a lesson and more clearly define winning before the combat starts, rather than trying to decide what winning means after the fighting has already begun. Do we have Korean or Vietnam veterans? Raise your hand, stand up. How about a round of applause for our warriors? To those warriors who won in Korea and Vietnam, we thank you. Congratulations and a job well done. Questions or discussion or comments? Yes, sir.
Roger, are those comments in your book, or is that something that you present?
This is a monograph I wrote for a military study, and this is a speech. I'll be glad to provide a copy. I've got a 60-page, hour-long read, footnoted. If you want it, I'll be glad to share it with anybody. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
So, Roger, if, as it is clear, we won in both of these conflicts, what do you think has contributed to the narrative that says we didn't?
Repeat the question.
Yeah, the question was, if we won, what's the narrative that we tied in Korea and lost in Vietnam? Why do we have that pathway ahead? Were those of you who were in your 20s or 30s and 60s, raise your hand. Did you believe anything otherwise? Right? You're surrounded every day by the media who is telling a story, and you're surrounded by political leaders who appear to be incompetently incapable of telling what the story they want to tell, right? Or getting your facts the right way. You know, there were tremendous amounts of losers in Vietnam and Korea. You know, the North Koreans were terrible losers. They're living a loss today. North Vietnam, in theory, won. They didn't, not against the United States, but they did win against South Vietnam 4 years after Americans were all gone. Yeah, Then they won a separate war. But then the North Vietnamese got defeated by China 2 years later. That's a war we've all forgotten about. But then North Vietnam went into, Cambodia. You know, so war is a continuing state. I'm not answering your question. I don't know. Why do you guys think? Why is our narrative that way it is?
I think in my father's generation, I mean, he remembers being in Europe when the Germans surrendered. And Halsey Hines, Commander Hines, who was a member of this club, was on the ship when the Japanese actually surrendered and admitted that we won the war. So I think that's the image that the public had, that there was some kind of a formal surrender by the other side.
That's, if you didn't hear him, he said there were surrenders, formal surrenders of the Germans and the Japanese in World War II, and in most other wars, most wars end inconclusively because both sides ran out of money. And if you can't pay your soldiers or feed them, the fighting stops. And that's the true history of warfare, after millions of deaths, perhaps. Surrender and absolute victory is a pretty rare thing. Absolute military victory is a pretty uncommon thing. There's probably another thread. When the World War II people came home, they came home as entire divisions, 20,000 people on a series of troop ships. They'd been together for 2, 3, or 5 years. They were a true band of brothers. They'd experienced something together. And from the day the war combat ended until the day they got back home might be in 6 months or 2 years in some cases. They were together and had to process and reprocess and keep working through everything they'd seen and done. And they got home and they were received by a country who was glad to see them, who had known they'd had a victory. Right? It was a giant one big team for all, and time to process and sort through it all. When Robert came home from Vietnam, it was probably by himself on an airline, landed at an airport somewhere wearing a uniform, not appreciated. Units in Vietnam were not cohesive units. They were replaced. If the one person was killed, another person got sent in. So a unit that was there, a unit in Vietnam might have stayed for 10 years, the whole time. The Big Red One was there almost the entire time. 101st Airborne was there almost the entire time. But the unit changed completely, just flipping and flipping and flipping. And when they came home, one by one, they never had processing time. They didn't get a chance to work through these things. If you got injured, if you were wounded in Vietnam, you were out of the country in a couple of days and never went back. And the people you had been with never heard of you again. So I think that's probably at the heart of it, is we didn't process very well. One more? Done? Great. I'll stick around as long as anybody wants. Thank you, Mark. Thank you.
Roger, thank you for embodying the four-way test. You will know very well what this coin is, so we would encourage you to pass that on to someone else.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And ironically, for a tank guy, the book today for you to sign the book plate on is Why Fly Guy? And we would be honored to present that to Ross Elementary in your honor. So
thank you, Mark.
Please sign that. Thank you. Did we mention Jim Blackburn last week at our meeting? I think we did, yes. So the board voted to take him to honorary status, and Roger and I planned to go visit him and inform him of that. And he was honored when we had a chance to visit him and award him the Century Plus Club Award. That was Roger's idea as well. And so we'll announce ahead of time when we're going to go do that and give all of you as much notice as we can. It may likely be after a lunch meeting in a couple of weeks, if we can both get that lined up and lined up with his family. But we'll do that, and as many of you as would like, I'm sure that would absolutely make Jim stay, and it'd be fun to go wish him well. Next week's meeting is down at the Ramada Hotel in the Grand Ballroom, and our program will be Dr. Jerry Farley from Washburn University. Also, please remember to look for registration emails for the June 6th event, and please consider being a host family or talking to anybody who you think might be interested in being a host family for a youth exchange student. With that, let's rise, say the 4.5-way test, and conclude. Of the things we think, say, or do, is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? And is it fun? Thank you. Have a great long weekend.